Some of the issues that I'd like to talk about today have to do with the value of the individual. Every individual person, the value of individuals. It's also a plea for the restoration of primitive Christianity, based upon the truth of the Bible. We spoke about that a little bit in our class. And based upon individual liberty of conscience in interpreting the Bible. I want to talk about the profound moral, cultural, and political effects of what we could call primitivism, the desire to go back to the primitive biblical way of doing things, the New Testament pattern, the Restoration Movement. What the Restoration Movement means, not just within the confines of Christendom, as we say, but what the Restoration ideal, as an ideal, can mean for our entire culture. And I believe it has far-reaching ramifications that are so much beyond just the confines of these four walls. I would want to show how, if I had the gift to do so, the Restoration Movement in the United States and in Great Britain is really the epitome, it's the apex of that yearning for human freedom and dignity that we used to study about even in our grammar schools. It is the essence, or it is the core of what we used to know as the American way, the American system. We could call it broadly Protestantism. We could call it the Reformation. We could more narrowly call it separatism, as we look at the separatists from the Church of England who went beyond the Puritans, or we could call it Puritanism. That was a stream, a definite stream, even a river of thought that flowed into the original colonies, and we can and we must call it primitivism. Our text will be taken from Genesis chapter 10. Turn with me briefly there. Verses 8 through 12. And we'll read a passage of Scripture that will be the fountain for all that we will consider. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh, in the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Asher, and builded Nineveh, and the city of Rehoboth, and Calah, and Reason between Nineveh and Calah, the same is the great city. Here we have an introduction to a figure who is known very, well, about which there's known very little. His memory has greatly been forgotten in our time, while there are many guesses about who Nimrod actually was. The name in the Hebrew means the rebel, and many have misunderstood our quaint King James translation. The better Hebrew translation is a little more rigid and strict in terms of criticizing Nimrod. He's not held up to be a good man and, a great pattern for hunters. Nothing wrong with hunting animals, especially for food or even for sport. But Nimrod is known more than just his prowess in being able to kill animals. Here he is a mighty man. Now this word Gibor in the Hebrew can suggest a hero, but like Hercules. And some have even identified Nimrod with the myth of Hercules from the Greek culture. That's not certain. Others have thought he might be Gilgamesh himself from the epic of the Sumerians, an ancient culture in what we call the land of Shinar. And there's very good reason to think that. One Dr. Livingston, an archaeologist who's conservative in his point of view, has argued at length that this has to be a Gilgamesh. When you look at the writings of the ancient Babylonians' ancestors, the Sumerians, and read the Gilgamesh epic, so much of what Gilgamesh was said to do coincides with the things we know about Nimrod, as is mentioned right here, the rebel, who is a man of power. He was a strong man. The Spanish people of our time say, el hombre fuerte. You'll hear that on the news when they talk about Fidel Castro, when they used to talk about Hugo Chavez, the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. A strong man, somebody who has ultimate power and reign in his kingdom. That's the idea behind the Hebrew Gabor. And this is what he was. He was the archetypal strongman, the primal representative of power politics. He was the first representative of tyrannical government. His rule was a rule by force, by violence. He began these kingdoms under those points of view and those methods. The ideal, of course, biblically, is to view civil government as one that does two major things. It rewards the good It punishes the wicked. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 10. But the ideal is rarely achieved. The ideal for marriage is one man, one woman for life, living together in love and harmony. That ideal is often not achieved. So civil government has collapsed and has been deteriorated into things God never meant for it to be. It is a necessity among human beings, especially sinful human beings, but it has been perverted to the point, as we see right here under the mighty man Nimrod, to the point of becoming oppressive of the rights and privileges of others. Even the devil himself said in the temptation of Jesus in Luke chapter 4, verses 5 and 6, that he would give to him all the kingdoms of this world, he said, for they've all been delivered unto me. Some have said that's a lie. No, that part was not really a lie. They willingly have delivered themselves over to Satan and to his rule, about which we'll speak more. Nimrod's rule began in the land of Shinar. It moved over into Assyria, modern-day Mosul, places where his very descendants of this time, in spirit and some maybe even genetically, that they are practicing the same kind of ruthless, cruel power politics. And this began in the cradle of civilization itself, Mesopotamia, between the rivers. Babylon is Shinar. When the Old Testament speaks of Shinar, it's referring to the ancient name for Babylon, modern-day Iraq. And Assyria, of course, would be just to the northern part of Iraq today. This whole kingdom of Nimrod and Shinar influenced the oppressive spirit of all subsequent civilizations. When we look at the influence over the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire, and then later the Persian Empire, a little bit to the east, Iran today. When we look at the influence it had over ancient Greece, and there was an interchange of ideas, and the kind of spirit of those kingdoms of power politics came from this cradle of civilization. When we look down in Egypt, especially among the pharaohs, this powerful supreme leader and oppressive tyrannical government over others. When we look at later on the Roman Empire, which had its good qualities and its bad qualities as well. When we look at all of the power politics and all the empires of the world, even unto our time, they all follow the spirit of Nimrod. Some have said it wasn't Gilgamesh, but maybe Sargon of Argate in the year 2300 BC. We don't know more about Nimrod, but we know he's not portrayed as a good man. He's the beginning of earthly governments, and as much as we need them, they get perverted just as he did. He's the mighty hunter. He hunted people, not just animals. And he also was a man who ruled by force. You know, eventually in the next chapter, chapter 11 of Genesis, there's a reference to the building of the Tower of Babel in the land of Shinar among his descendants, literally and metaphorically, or figuratively speaking. And that was an attempt to raise the temple of Ziggurat to the heavens, to the heights to where all men would unify under the one rule of a Nimrod type and one world earthly government, and would all rebel against God. His name is Rebel, and this is significant. God, in the Bible, has always recognized the evils of human oppression. We mentioned a while ago the pharaohs. The very word is used in Exodus 3 and verse 9 to refer to the oppression of God's people, the Hebrews, as they had become enslaved in the land of Egypt. And of course, God, with a mighty hand, eventually would deliver them from slavery. That was a good thing. The slavery itself was evil. Then we come to the time when they inhabit the land early, the period of the judges. And here there were not permanent leaders selected. Rather, you had tribal leaders, and they worked together. You can see the organization when you read the Pentateuch of how the tribes all worked together. And they occupied different portions of the land, and they were a loose confederation. They were a confederacy under God directly. They answered to God. From time to time, there would be problems. The Philistines, a power people who had come from the Mediterranean world, a mixture culturally of some of the Greek ideas and also of Hamitic ways from Ham. Those people had come in and afflicted them constantly, would raid them and come up into the mountains and go back to the plain, the coastal plains where they lived. And they needed judges. Now, the word's not really a good word in English, and we call these the judge. They are judges, but they do more than just sit in judgment. They were actually like warriors, chieftains, warlords, you could say, that God would appoint for specific periods of time to go and fight against the enemies. And then when their period, or they'd served their purpose, they would wane in influence so that there would not be too much power in Israel. God had often recognized all along had warned them about direct central or centralized government. But the people didn't listen. They looked around them and they saw the kingdoms of in Shinar and Babylon and Syria. They saw how men had erected kingdoms. And the people of Israel wanted a kingdom like that with one strong man at the top, a king who has all authority. Samuel the prophet warned them as he spoke for God in 1 Samuel chapter 8. You do not want this arrangement. It will be awful for you. Oh no, we want it. No, he said, you do not want it because the king will take away your liberty. He will tax you. He will make you serve in his fields. He will make you serve in his army, conscript you against your will. You have it good now serving God directly. They couldn't see God. We don't see God. It took faith to believe that they were a theocracy under God. They could see a king, and I think there's a tinge of idolatry in this request. They could see an earthly king, a big, strong man like Saul, the son of Kish. That's what we want. We want to see who can protect us against the Philistines and others. God finally said, if that's what you want, you're rejecting my rulership over you directly and immediately. I'll give you a king, and you know, be careful what you ask for. You just might get it. They did, and exactly as God had predicted, it came about. The early kings were all right. Saul had his faults, terrible, tragic faults. Solomon was a good king. David was a good king, but they had their faults, and they constantly taxed the people. They had to have a centralized government in one place to rule over the entire nation, where all gave up their autonomy to the one centralized authority. Throughout the years, this prevailed until the time when Solomon passed away, and the kingdom was then up for grabs. There had already been a division culturally and religiously early between the 10 tribes to the north and the tribes to the south, Judah and Benjamin. The southern kingdom was already there in potential, you might say, before Rehoboam came along. And here he decided as a new king, here's how I'll act. He asked the old men, what should I do? The old men said, be lighter than your father. Lower the taxation. Give the people more liberty. Grant more freedom. All right, that's one idea. Then he went to his peers, and they thought, if I were a king, I'd want to have all authority. Be tough on them. Be strong on them. So he listened to the foolish advice of his peers, and he went and made it strong, the kingdom, and he split it wide open. And that's predictable. So the northern kingdom went off under Jeroboam. The southern kingdom lasted for many years. God had warned them. They would not listen. So that was the culmination of despotic rule down in 1 Kings 12, the division of the kingdom. Oppression is mentioned in the Bible, in the wisdom literature. It's often mentioned and it's decried. In places like Proverbs 30 and verse 14. There is a generation whose teeth are as swords and their jaw teeth as knives to devour the poor from off the earth and the needy from among men. And then the sad words of Ecclesiastes 4 and verse 1. So I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. Foreign oppression also was brought into Israel. This by the providence of God, as He warned them, you'll be vulnerable as you leave me and leave my rulership directly. As you follow idolatry, they did not listen. God then sent, as He had earlier sent Philistines and Amalekites and others to fight against, God then sent bigger kingdoms from the land of Shinar. Came, for example, in that area of Nineveh, came the Assyrians, a horrific people, a monstrous people with no love and no respect for human life, to destroy man and beast, young and old, even the suckling child. They would come in and they would impale people on stakes in the middle of the road and laugh at the cruelty they inflicted upon others, just as their descendants, many of them to this day, will still do. And as that happened, God was warning His people, you'll be taken away. The northern kingdom was taken away, and it was so far gone, it was totally obliterated. It ceased to exist. The southern kingdom had a ray of hope for it. There were a few good people. There was a remnant in the southern kingdom. They were taken away into the land of Shinar, to Nimrod's earlier holdings, to Babylon for 70 years, where they suffered, and God taught them to get rid of idolatry. They came back and were restored to the homeland. Then, unfortunately, the Greeks came. Following that same power politics, the Greeks conquered them. And eventually, when you come down to the middle of the 2nd century BC under Judas Maccabeus and his brothers and that family, there was some reprieve. Actually, what they had done was, we should mention, the kingdom of the Greeks had divided up, and the Ptolemies to the Ptolemaic Empire to the south in Egypt was constantly coming in and putting its boot on the neck of the Judeans. And then they would lose their influence, and the Seleucids, the Syrians to the north, part of the old kingdom of Alexander the Great, came down and put their boot on their neck. They were worse than the Egyptians, and eventually Judas Maccabeus had enough, and he rose up in a mighty furor and overthrew them. And for a period of time they enjoyed their independence. Then 63 BC comes Pompey, a mighty ruler from Rome. And that ancient spirit of oppression, of tyranny that had existed from the time of Nimrod was brought with them, and they took away Jewish autonomy once again. And you know the rest of the story. That was oppression that punished them. Roman rule was a reality in the time of Christ. And yet, there's something far more sinister. There's also a phenomenon we could call religious tyranny. And the beginning of that tyranny over mankind, in fact, the beginning of all tyranny of any stripe or hue, actually started in the Garden of Eden with the encounter of the serpent and Mother Eve. In Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 to 7, Satan came and interposed himself between Adam and Eve and their sublime relationship of God, of submission and obedience, and taught them to distrust God, taught them to trust in themselves and to attempt to become gods, and prompted them to disobey. From that, as a direct consequence, they lost the right and the freedom to live in the Garden of Eden, the paradise. They lost also the right to the tree of life, Genesis 3:24. Satan continues to exercise his dominion in the same way, through the lie, through webs of lies, through deception, through deceit. He is a liar, Jesus said, John 8:44, and the father of it. All lies trace themselves back to the primordial lie told to Eve there in the beginning. All oppression comes from that original lie. Lies entice us to sin, to follow Satan. Satan discourages the truth. He promotes ignorance, because with ignorance comes more sin. Just as he lied to Eve, she was ignorant. She had known earlier the truth. She willfully dismissed it from her mind, became ignorant of the truth, and was enslaved to sin. As Jesus said, we are slaves, servants to sin if we obey it. John 8:33 to 34. Satan then is the real power behind the throne of all of these Nimrod-type kingdoms and ideologies and cultures that have existed throughout world history. All tyrannical systems, whether it be some Oriental despot, some Marxist modern communist regime, or some radical Islamic caliphate, they all trace in spirit their origins back to Satan in the Garden of Eden through Nimrod. It kind of reminds me, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, of that old song, and he took a lot of flack for this, that Mick Jagger wrote along with another friend about sympathy for the devil. And you've heard that. They play it all the time on the rock stations today. It has kind of a catchy beat where the devil says, I've been around for a long, long year. And then mentions all the places, all the horrific things that have happened in world history. The crucifixion of Jesus. I was there when Pilate wiped his hand of the matter. And he also mentions later on the Romanovs, the czars of Russia, as they were murdered, and Anastasia, she cried out when she saw it happen. I was there when that horrible thing happened and the communists took over, the Bolsheviks took over Russia. I was there in the Blitzkrieg. Now, the song to me is meaningful because whether they were devil worshipers or not, that was something that was alleged, is irrelevant. It's meaningful because he is there. He has been there. Nimrod has always been there. And Nimrod is just the manifestation of Satan himself, coming down even to our own day. Satan has also used, then, even religious despotism throughout history. Satan's servants, priests, shamans, gurus, religious leaders of any stripe or hue, always have used deceit and deception to oppress the people. And even Satan can appear as an angel of light, 2 Corinthians 11:13 to 15. And Paul says he uses ignorance to keep down descent to his dominion. He says this in principle in 2 Corinthians 4:3, in whom the God of this world, that's Satan, hath blinded the minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. Satan, his minions who follow him, have always used ignorance. They have always used collective ignorance of the masses to keep down and to suppress the individual and the worth and dignity of those who seek for the truth. You doubt that? Go to Cuba. I was in Cuba a number of years ago and saw people who were fearful about turning on the shortwave radio and listening to Radio Marti from the United States, the voice of America. They did so secretly in their bedrooms with it turned down low because they didn't want to go to jail. Yes, the Cubans do oppress religious people. Not as bad as North Korea, but still bad. Not as bad as China, but it's still very bad. So that system has not been changed. It's still there. There are other examples in the modern world. Just recently, some adolescent boys made the horrific mistake of what? Watching a soccer game on television. And these cutthroats, murderous Muslims, among so-called ISIS, ISIL, whatever they are, destroyed their lives, took their lives, killed them for watching a soccer. You see, Satan does not want us to learn and know. Satan, through his servants, does not want us to know and to be informed. And they might have learned something about the outside world. It's seen throughout history. Yes, there was a Levitical priesthood, and I want us to know there was a major difference between the priesthood of God in the Old Testament and all of these pagan priests. That priesthood was a priesthood composed of men who were selected by God to serve in their office, who offered sacrifices for themselves as well as for the people. There was equality. They were the ones to whom the people would go to have intercession, and that was pointing to the fact someday a great intercessor would have to come, Christ. It was inherently temporary. It was not God's intention that throughout all ages there be such an earthly separate priesthood. And in that period of time, it served its function. They were to teach the law to the people, but not be the sole arbiters of truth and law. In fact, the people were to know the law. Deuteronomy chapter 6, 6-9, the people were to teach it to their children, to write upon frontlets and put it on their forehead, to write upon the posts of their houses and gates. And of course, that encouraged literacy among the people to know the Word of God and not to be dependent solely upon the teaching of the priests. But sadly, in history, the priesthood was perverted also. And by the time of Christ, the Sadducees, or the ruling caste in Jerusalem, they're totally corrupt. The Pharisees were the ones who had cultural dominance, but not political power. The Sadducees actually forbade our brothers in Christ from preaching the truth of the gospel. It happened even in the colonies here. As we move forward to our own period of time, Episcopalians, the Church of England, in the United States, well, before there was the United States, in the colonies, made it illegal for the Baptists to preach. But the Baptists, being what they were, as what they should be then, spoke up and they preached the gospel. They were arrested more than once, and one was standing on trial and was going to be punished for preaching the gospel. The fiery Patrick Henry was brought in to defend the Baptists for their preaching against the Anglican strictures against preaching. I can't repeat what he said exactly, but I can say this. He first of all reminded the judge, these men are on trial for preaching the gospel? Now this is from an English people with an English background who realized how absurd that was when he said it. And then he could only exclaim some great ejaculation to God, as it were, to heaven. And that was the end of it. They let him go. They were so ashamed. You go back to the time of the Sadducees again. Same kind of thing's been going on for centuries. They told the brethren, do not speak in the name of Jesus. We're warning you. Well, is it logical, the brethren asked these fishermen? Jesus did not choose the elite, the most educated, with the exception of Paul. But generally his apostles were fishermen, blue-collar types. And these blue-collar types came in. And they said, whether it's right to obey you or God, you judge yourself, but we can only speak the things which we've seen and heard. Later they're warned again, be quiet. You don't have the freedom of speech. And they said boldly, we ought to obey God rather than men, Acts 5:29. And that's been the rallying cry from the beginning of those who love truth throughout history, all the way to our own period of time. Jesus had warned us, though, what would happen in Matthew 20, verses 25-27. You know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servant. This is why Peter could say later, as an elder in the church, 1 Peter 5 and verse 3, elders are not to be lords over God's heritage, but ensample to the flock. And yet, even then, A falling away from that pure, simple, sweet standard of truth was predicted. Apostasy was predicted. How would apostasy come about according to these early prophecies in the New Testament? 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 to 3. Now, the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of demons, speaking lies in hypocrisy, having their conscience seared as with a hot iron. Notice, forbidding to marry. See the power involved? The old spirit of Nimrod. Commanding to abstain from meats, food, which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. That old spirit was already going to rear its head even in the Lord's church of tyranny, of oppression. And it was warned about in 2 Thessalonians 2, 2 to 4. We don't know the exact identification of the son of perdition. But Paul says in that falling away, the son of perdition would be manifested. Traditionally, Protestants have interpreted him as being the Pope of Rome, or at least the Holy See, the hierarchy of the church, because he will show himself to be God. He will sit in the very temple of God, perhaps a reference to the church, even later in corrupted form. So there's this ultimate power where the Pope claims to be the vicar of Christ on earth, the very God of gods here in human forms. Apostasy did come about gradually, increasingly through the centuries. A hierarchy, centralized government within the church, rather than the simple plan of autonomous, independent congregations where power was spread out and shared, authority was spread out and shared, and there was love and harmony between them. There were powerful congregations that imposed their will on the weaker, poorer congregations, powerful bishops, and eventually the Bishop of Rome, after a great fighting with other bishops from other major cities, finally won out by pure power politics and became the so-called head of the church, the Pope of Rome. The Pope, or Constantine rather, I should mention, we know the Roman Emperor legalized Christianity in the 4th century. That was a good thing, and it was a bad thing. It was good because persecution subsided. It was bad because Constantine also and some of his successors melded the church and state together. Well, wouldn't that be wonderful to have a theocracy? No, not really. Look what happens. As the church is corrupted and as it's growing apostate and falling away from the standard, it's gaining more political power. And it uses the power of the sword to enforce its will and to impose it upon its subjects. So that you had Constantine, who was a Roman emperor, put his stamp upon or impress upon the church, and eventually the developed popes of Rome, in fact the entire Roman hierarchy. You can prove this beyond a shadow of a doubt historically. The entire Roman hierarchy was based upon the hierarchy of the Roman Empire. The emperor at the top, the Pope, correspond. He's nothing but an ecclesiastical emperor. Those who followed him as cardinals, the Senate. And we don't say much about our senators today because they're modeled after that Roman Senate. And all of the lesser magistrates in the Roman Empire have their corresponding figures, religious figures, in the Roman church. There's almost a one-to-one correspondence down the line of the hierarchy. That church became the old shell of Rome as the Goths and the Visigoths and other hordes came in from Germany and eventually destroyed the original Roman Empire. Out of the ashes came the Roman Catholic Church, not the church of the Bible in any sense of the word. And it was based upon oppression. It was the tyranny that was once Rome. It was the tyranny that was once Greece, that was once Persia, once Assyria, the tyranny once Babylon, the land of Shinar, once the kingdom of Nimrod. Now it's the tyranny of false Christianity. Now it's the tyranny of secular Marxist regimes, which is, by the way, the flip side of Catholic Christianity. Marxism is just Christianity on the mirror end, turned upside down. And the tyranny of Muslim fundamentalists. Now the church and all like them who want to oppress have kept their subjects in ignorance throughout the years. All had to go through the special priest, the special caste they developed, basing it upon pagan ideas and also some Judaistic ideas. You had to go to the priest to receive absolution. There is no forgiveness apart from the church. You cannot go to heaven or get out of purgatory. You'll be lost if you don't have the church. The church and its hierarchy is it. It's the way to do it. And they find every trick under the stars to be able to absolve people of sins. A man died back in the 40s in a brothel in the United States. And as he was dying, they called in a priest to administer the last rites. But the man had not lived very well. He was dying in a brothel, a house of ill repute. He had lived in those houses as a Navy man, I think he was, for many, many decades. And as the priest spoke to him, he says, are you showing remorse for this? He said, no, I liked all the women I've known. All the Hong Kong women, they're the best. I love the Chinese. And he started talking about his exploits. And the priest was wondering, because time was running out, the man was dying. Well, what can we do? Do you show any remorse? Are you sorry that you were with all those women? No, can't say that I was. Don't you wish you could feel remorse? He asked. Are you sorry that you're not sorry? Well, yes, I am sorry that I'm. That's enough. That's all I need. You're forgiven. Setting himself up as Christ himself to forgive under the flimsiest of pretexts. And this is the Roman system and has ever been thus since the church was corrupted. They don't want us to know church teaching from the Bible. They want us to know church teaching from the priests. The Bible was considered dangerous at one time. It still really is, but they have to be careful saying that in the modern world. They don't really want us to know what their real view of the Bible is. But, of course, it was dangerous to what? To their corrupt system of lies. So, you have early on, enough is enough. You have some early rumblings, in the time of Wycliffe and others even prior to that. The morning star of the Reformation, who could see clearly things that many around them were not courageous enough to see or had not yet discovered. And they spoke out against the abuses of the Roman Church, about the power and the tyranny. And you even had a modern movement in the Renaissance known as humanism, not the kind of humanism that's secular in our time, but which put a premium upon the individual rather than the group. You see, back then in medieval times, you were just to be a part of the greater whole. You're just a cog in the great machine, just one little wheel. You're not of any great value of yourself. And ever since, oppressors have used that point of view and have disrespected the idea of individualism. Ignorance and oppression go hand in hand. Truth and freedom go hand in hand. John 8:32, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Charles George, in his book on the revolution, European radicals from Huss to Lenin, said the very act of learning in the humanist way is revolt. Reaching back in time and across barriers of space to read of and ponder other reality than one's own is to threaten the authority, in personal terms at least, of what is. Political correctness is a silly little euphemism that we use today ad nauseum. It's hackneyed now. But it is, in fact, one that was borrowed from the Marxists, and as we apply it to the secularists and the progressivists of our time, it's just a way of saying those who do not want us to see across time, to see across the barriers of space, to have a larger idea than that which is imposed by the secular system and all the mentioned in the educational departments of our universities and throughout our public school system. And these things have ever been with us. Satan has then always found a way to oppress people through the authority of those with power. Today's leaders in authoritarian regimes, including that which is developing in our country, prefer what we call low information voters. They don't like that. I don't care. That's a perfectly good description. Low information voters. Those who don't know a lot and who don't care, who at the last minute vote for them. Oh, I'll get free cheese. That's my man. I'll vote for him. They could care less about the larger, more important issues of maybe our Constitution or moral questions. And this ignorance has always been something used throughout centuries. It was used by the Catholic Church in England to keep down dissent in the 15th century especially. By the 1400s, David Daniel says in the Bible in English, it's a thick book, I have 900 pages, 899 at the end of the index, that Wycliffe's translation was a threat to power. Wycliffe, had overseen the translation of Scripture from the Latin, as Chris pointed out, into English. Oh no, that can't be done. Then the common man can read the Bible for himself, because the common man would speak English then. He didn't read the Latin. And if the common man reads it, he'll know what's going on. The gig is up. So Wycliffe, of course, was a persona non grata. The church was sanctioning beliefs, David Daniel says, and practices that were unbiblical in the 1400s. Only trouble could follow that discovery by ordinary people. To see that the church was corrupt. When ordinary people found it out, only trouble would come. Wycliffe was persecuted. Most of his writings were destroyed. But there were souls in Czechoslovakia, we know it today, Bohemia. Don't laugh. We call them Bohemians, but we don't. The earlier Bohemians were models because they had the fires of liberty in their own belly. And they read the writings of John Wycliffe. And John Huss later on read Wycliffe and stood up for primitivism. By the way, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we found out there are libraries filled with Wycliffe documents. They were destroyed in England, but they persisted in Bohemia. George says about Huss, he taught radical Christian primitivism. Sounds like something we're trying to do right here today. Above all, the vision of true Christianity is a revelation, simple, universal, overwhelming, personal, and not essentially a mystery commanded by the priests. Alistair McGrath, in his book On the Beginning, the Story of the English Bible, says about Wycliffe, the English people had a right to read the Bible in their own language rather than to be forced to listen to what their clergy wished them to hear. As Wycliffe pointed out, the ecclesiastical establishment had a considerable vested interest in not allowing the laity access to the Bible. They might even discover that there was a massive discrepancy between the lifestyles of the bishops and clergy and those commended and practiced by Christ and the apostles. Wycliffe thus threatened to destroy the whole edifice of clerical domination in matters of theology and church life. The translation of the Bible into English would be a social leveler on a hitherto unknown scale. All would be able to read Christendom's sacred text and judge both the lifestyle and teachings of the medieval church on its basis. The very idea sent shockwaves throughout the complacent church of the day. Writing on page 19. And I think McGrath has nailed it perfectly. Because the access of the Bible in the language of the common man to the individual searcher was really the spark that ignited the fires of revolution. Some went awry, but they weren't necessarily in France ignited by this spark. It was different. It was one of seeking bread in circuses. It was one of secularism. The French Revolution went awry because it was not built upon the proper foundation. In the United States, our forefathers, not all of them, because the Anglicans followed, the power politics that had been part of it, there's always been a division there in that culture of those who yearn for liberty, who sought it, even way back to the Magna Carta. Throughout history, power politics were brought over into this shore. The earliest were the Puritans, landing at Plymouth and in the 17th century. Then later, of course, the establishment came, and as we mentioned, instances of persecution even in the colony. But there's ever been that desire for what's right. The true revolution of this country, the essence was built upon the idea of the individual with the right to interpret the Bible. These people who came who were not just Puritans. Puritans remained within the Anglican fellowship. These were separatists. And some of them, if you read their writings, were very, very close to the truth. They were not following the principles all the way to their logical extreme, but they were getting closer and closer. That's why I say the ideal of the restoration that we cry for in our time is just to push the limits of the envelope to the farthest extent. And it is the essence of what we used to know as America. A country built upon God. Yes, historically this nation is built upon a framework of belief in God. Not Allah, not atheism, but the God of Judeo-Christian, actually the God of Protestants. When Catholics came in great numbers, they have watered down what we knew as the original America. There are many fine, good Catholic people. There are many good American Catholics as they have been trained by the former Protestant point of view that's here. But this nation was formed historically by Protestants. Those who believed in the reformation of the corruption, who believed in the right of individual liberty. And our Constitution was made in order to guarantee that. There are privileges then for us to know individually the truth. But I want to close by saying there are also, with those privileges, grave responsibilities. I have the privilege. Romans 14:12 says, so then every one of us shall give account of himself to God. The hierarchy cannot give account for me, the hierarchy of the church. The state cannot. No one, no group can give account for me. On the day of judgment, there's no one there but you and God, as it were. It will be you and God. It will be God and me. I will answer. You individual answer. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 10, every one of us shall stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Everyone, not just judging nations, not judging cultures, not judging families or churches, individually. That's why there's so much dignity and worth placed upon the individual, because of the awesome responsibility. I have the privilege to know the truth, and that means I have to have the courage to speak out on it. The ability to speak the truth is a God-given right. It didn't come about in the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights in our country simply recognized what God all along had said. We ought to obey God rather than men. We must preach the gospel to every creature, despite opposition. And the opposition is ever with us. The same kind of tyranny that has always been there from the beginning in the land of Shinar, throughout the Roman Empire, into Great Britain even. It still manifests itself today. And we're living in a precarious time where the original American ideals are quickly being forgotten. How? We let them take over the school system. We let it happen on our watch. I say we, the generations that should have stood up and have kept control of the schools, we let them take it. Now the secularists are teaching their points of view with a vengeance. And they're wiping out all understanding and last, vestige of Christian belief in this country. Christianity is proscribed in the teaching of our school system. Why? Because it creates free men. It creates men that power politics cannot deal with. It creates men who will stand up and speak truth to power. And that they cannot put up with because it's an inherent threat to their establishment. So we're living in a very precarious time. There's only one way we can solve the issue. And that's the way it was solved in the first century, and in the second century, and the third century. Not by the mass media. They didn't have it then. Not even by the printed page per se. They spoke one to one, person to person, and shared the gospel of Christ. They subverted an entire Roman pagan society. Subverted in a good way. Came in and taught them true morality, one on one. And that's the only way still available to us today. If we could convert the majority of Americans, the power politics from above, the elitists would no longer have a base that would follow them. And they would, of course, pass the way of all tyrants. Today, if you need to respond to the gospel, we'd urge you to be baptized for the remission of sins. If you need to confess wrong, we'd urge you to do that. Whatever your need is, let it be known now, while together we stand and sing.